Thank you very much. Thanks. Anyone who's ever seen me speak know that I usually roam around the stage and am animated and use a lot of body stuff. So this is going to really cramp me a little bit, but we'll see how this goes. First of all, thanks to all the staff for making this so easy. Mary and everyone else, thanks ever so much for this. Let me just, it's been an interesting experience to sort of follow Dan. I've heard Dan speak before, and I don't know if you noticed, but you may be following this term of resilience has sometimes the most common definition of resilience that people tend to bandy around is something along the lines of, you know, our capacity to overcome adversity. And I just don't write that down because it sucks as a definition, by the way. I think what we've done is we've tended to individualize resilience, and you get a lot of sort of motivational speakers talking about resilience in that highly individualized, I made it through adversity kind of way. And it makes great television, and you know, you get on Oprah, or used to get on Oprah, but it's actually not scientifically true. What we're actually understanding about resilience is a far more complex story, and increasingly, what's interesting for me is that I'm finding myself sharing the stage with neurobiologists, epigeneticists, community disaster people, climatologists, people who are thinking about environmental factors, political policy wonks, journalists. Suddenly what we're beginning to do is understand resilience in far more complex terms, especially in relation to some of the complex problems that we're having to respond to. Now, what I'm basically doing, what I'm trying to do over the next hour, I guess, is just give you another map. Dan gave us a relational neurobiology map this morning to understand coping and well-being and capacity for children. And in a sense, it snugs up really well to roots of empathy, for sure. What I'd like to do is think a little bit more broadly. I'm the social scientist, so I'm going to sort of come at this from a slightly different angle. And what I'm going to suggest is that what Roots of Empathy is basically doing is seeding the foundation stones for a more resilient set of community practices. That, in a sense, they're providing the building blocks for something much bigger. Now, I don't have direct experience with the program, but I would like to bring you a couple of stories as we go through this. So I don't know about you, but I learn, if I have a theory, I do some of this big high-level theory stuff, I read all the journals, I do all the research, but unless it makes sense at the level of an individual child, you don't really hold on to it, do you? It doesn't make any sense to keep it. So a little while ago, when I was working as a clinician, I still work a bit as a clinician, but when I was in a little more full-time practice, I met a a girl about age 6. And she was dragged into my office one Monday morning by her mother, and the mother sort of dragged this little girl in and turned to me and said, pushed her in front of me and said, "Fix the little thief." Now, you know you're going to have an interesting day when your sort of starts that way, right? And the backstory of this was a little girl. Her mom had just recently moved to the community. There was a younger child at home, single parent, not a lot of resources. And this child, though, was quite well behaved and everything else. And she was going to school. She hadn't made many friends. And we were up this had already been about 6 or 8 weeks into the semester of school. She was feeling isolated. She didn't have a lot of connections. And in her own little way, this little 6-year-old mind had wanted to solve the problem of not having any friends. So what she'd done all on her own, since nobody was noticing her, I mean, nobody was paying attention to her, she wasn't making any noise in the classroom, so everyone was just basically ignoring her. I mean, this wasn't like Honey Boo Boo or something like this, you know. She wasn't some big personality. So she decided that she would, at lunch hour, sneak off the school playground, and there were some kids that went home for school, so it wasn't completely odd that some children would be leaving the playground at lunch. And she went across the street on her own, went into a 7-Eleven store, and filled up one of those little brown paper bags of candies. And, you know, the gummy bears and the gummy worms and all those kinds of things that taste really good when you're 6 years old. And then what she did was she figured out a way to get out of the store with the candy, because she had no money or anything. And she realized that if she stood between 2 adults at the checkout counter, Because let's face it, if I'm standing in the checkout counter and I look behind me and I see a 6-year-old, I'm assuming she's with you. And if you're standing behind me looking down, you assume she's with me. And so she just kind of magically walked out of the 7-Eleven with her bag of candy, came back to the school playground and began to hand out the candy. Instantly, she had friends. Now, from a social-emotional learning capacity, you got to admit, that's not a bad little experiment, is that? That was interesting. Now, the problem was, of course, that after a few weeks of doing this, believe it or not, it actually went on for weeks. Somebody noticed that everyone was always chewing around this kid, and they figured it out, and they called the mother and said, basically, we have a serious problem here. Your daughter's been doing this and this and this, and she's stealing candy and coming back and everything else. The mother was absolutely certain that this was for her, this was serious. It was going to go from stealing candy, next it was going to be, crack cocaine and heroin addictions and on the streets and prostitution. I mean, she had this whole thing mapped out for her. So she was really, triggered and upset. I stopped the process in my office. I said to the little girl, I said, just tell me, I'm just curious. What happens when you steal the candy? I wasn't going to, blame her. I wasn't going to get into, candy stealing bad. I figured she'd already figured all that stuff. I just said to her, what happens when you steal the candy? And she said, I have friends. I thought, surely, as a mental health staff, as a school staff, as a community, we could figure out how to help a little 6-year-old who's new to a community have friends. Now, it's hard to have kids make friends or force them to have friends. So what we did was, thinking about the way I think about resilience, I understood, though, that if you increase someone's social desirability or standing, people tend to get drawn to them a little bit more. So what we did was we worked with the school to set it up so this little girl would basically, twice a week, or I think it was initially once a week, one of the assistants from the junior kindergarten would come up to the grade 1 classroom, knock on the door and excuse the class and say, sorry to interrupt, we're having a bit of problem. We're short a little bit of staff down in the JK, in the junior kindergarten. We really need some help teaching the little ones. Could Ginny, who's the girl's name, could Ginny come down and give us a hand? Now, if you can imagine John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, walking around all full of himself and everything else, right? And imagine that he sort of she pushes back from her desk, and she walks out of that classroom just as proud as you could be. Excuse me, I have to now go teach. Now, the good thing was that it drew kids to her. She became somebody of repute within the school. She got some attention, right? And it was all very positive. And of course, the stealing dropped off instantly. But I've heard some critiques of that intervention. One critique was, you rewarded bad behavior. To which I said, you don't understand child development, right? That's not really how children think. Oh, I'm going to go steal candy, so then I can be rewarded by then going down and teaching the JKs. It was, just not how kids think. The second critique I hear sometimes from parents, unfortunately, is, well, if it was good enough for Ginny, then my child should have the same responsibilities. And you go, oh my God, you missed it. If every child had that same responsibility, there would have been no impact on little Ginny. There's a big difference between well-being and resilience. Well-being is what we all need. My assumption is those other 28 children in that classroom are already getting somebody who does, I don't know, my kids were in piano, my kids are all sort of university age and stuff now, but when they were like 5 and 6 years old, has anybody else gone through those torturous piano recitals with your 6-year-old where they kind of plunked away, and you and the grandparents and the uncles and the aunts were in the audience doing the wave, whoa, that was really good, wow, The point is, Ginny needed that intervention. Now, what we're actually beginning to understand then about resilience is we need a more complicated story to tell about it than just this inner capacity. Ginny was able to overcome a difficult situation, a difficult transition, and adapt well because we facilitated her access to the resources she needed in ways that made sense to her. I could have just sent her off to a psychologist, no offense to psychologists. I could have just sent her off to a social worker. We could have just done all kinds of other things, but it wouldn't have solved the problem, would it? It wasn't what she needed. So what I wanted to sort of help you to understand here is that there's this notion of resilience as an emerging field. Now, there is still, though, a little bit of a lingering thought. We often see quotes like this, right? Now, John Kabat-Zinn is quite powerful. I'm sure some of you may have heard him speak, and he's University of Massachusetts, School of Medicine. He's done a lot of that stuff on looking at, again, also somewhat the neurobiology of the impact of mindfulness practices on stress reduction. Very, very sort of leading edge work. And I recently heard him speak in Washington, and he said, you know, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf, which is a very sort of powerful notion of us overcoming adversity. I don't disagree with the statement, but it's actually not a good representation of what we know makes us resilient. That statement implies it's about you learning to surf, when in fact what we know is it's a heck of a lot easier to learn to surf if you have a surfboard, a coach, and a lifeguard. If you have a program, if you have an intervention that brings these things to you. So I'm always a little bit cautious when I begin to sort of get this storyline that somehow resilience is something inside of us, when in fact it's our inner capacities that are enacted by the environment around us. And we know this from all kinds of data. I mean, this is not my own research. This is a study out of British Columbia that looked at a cohort study of about over 5,000 kids. And what they did was, this was asking them a series of questions. And what they basically said are, have you ever been physically or sexually abused? And if so, do you have any thoughts of suicide? Do you have any sort of suicidal ideation? And no surprise to people in this room, of course, there's a high correlation between suicidal ideation and physical and sexual victimization. There's no controversy on that one. But what was interesting about the study is then they asked the kids, do you feel engaged at your school? And the rates, to the extent that a child answered, I feel engaged, I feel connected to my school, not what my academic grades are, but do I feel connected to my school? Do I feel like I belong at my school? In fact, let me ask you, how many of you have your own children? How many of you have children in your school? And do any of your children, when they reach the school campus, does anybody greet them by name? Or when they were in, say, elementary or junior high, did anybody greet them by name as they came onto the school campus? No? I'm sorry to hear that. Some of you did have that experience. What we're understanding is that can be a really powerful experience. And again, if your child's doing really well and you made them a perfect breakfast and gave them that little peck on the cheek and they pushed them out the door and everything was perfect and they're feeling in a good mood and everything is great, okay, who cares if a teacher made the effort to greet them as they came into the school campus? But for the child that didn't have that morning scenario, that could potentially be the one moment of connection, of change, a moment to sort of integrate themselves and to say, I belong somewhere. And it could have a potentially profound impact. And in fact, what the data here is showing is, in fact, that's the case. Now, I'm not saying we get rid of all the psychologists or social workers and guidance counselors, because there's still a group of kids, even when they're connected, they still feel suicidal. But from a resilience point of view, we have to begin to sort of understand that before we basically, every time a kid says they're suicidal, we respond by shuffling them off to an hour of therapy. What we need to begin to think about is more complex models of understanding that they might be asking for something different and much more holistic, that is much more sustaining than a limited time, narrow intervention. So my own work on resilience is beginning to sort of understand that we need to sort of change our conversation here. And I'm going to suggest, a little while ago, I'm surprised we actually got this published. I got this published in Journal of Clinical Psychology and Psychiatry, which is really quite a good journal. I'm surprised they actually published this, because what I said was, why don't we look at diagnosing resilience, which is kind of an oxymoron. You're supposed to diagnose disorders. I said, well, what if we actually diagnose resilience? How would we do it? And what we came to understand was we would have to, first of all, assess the level of exposure to adversity. This notion of one thing curing all is not actually true. You can't just say self-esteem equals resilience or something simplistic like that. So if I could, just for a moment, if I could suggest the first thing you need to do is think about resilience as, well, what is the severity of the stressor that you've experienced? What is the chronicity of that stressor? How many ecological levels are you being exposed to stress at? For instance, if you have a learning challenge, but you just have a learning challenge, but you're in a great family, then it's a relatively low stress. You have the same learning challenge, but now you're in a family exposed to poverty and violence and political upset, and you're in a low-resource community because the tax base doesn't provide adequately for your school board and all these other stuff. That learning challenge is that much more of a risk factor in your life than otherwise. It's not categorical. As, of course, is how you attribute the causality. Is it my problem or is it my community's problem? And, of course, whether or not it's culturally or contextually relevant. If you live in a community where basically almost nobody goes past grade 3, a learning challenge may not be that much of a problem or experienced as that much of a problem to you individually. And what we're actually seeing then in terms of modeling out resilience, what I'm going to say is that at lower levels of risk, what we actually see is a pattern where things like temperament, personality, personal cognitions, attitudes, beliefs, those things tend to be good buffers against stress at lower levels of risk exposure. But when you're living in much more complex and dangerous environments, what we seem to need is your resilience would depend on whether or not the resources you need are available and accessible, whether or not you can make strategic use of what you have around you. So for instance, if you're in a really toxic school environment or a really toxic community environment and you sort of socially isolate and withdraw, it could be that that is a strategic use of your environment that is actually more successful than if you continue to sort of propel yourself into a dangerous and toxic environment, say on the school grounds or in your family or elsewise. In other words, I'm painting a picture here of a very dynamic model, as well as what's reinforced by those around you. And of course, what is the adaptive capacity of your environment to give you what you need? Now, coming back to a program and interventions like something, obviously like Roots of Empathy, I know that you're, Mary, I know that you're branching into more and more sort of communities that are at higher and higher risk, and you're taking the program globally. And I've also been hearing this conversation saying that there's a bit of a dance going on, isn't there? As you enter communities that are at higher risk, what is the impact of the program? I often get asked to us, we evaluate programs as well. We do a lot of evaluations all over the globe of programs. And I'm often asked, well, what will be the impact of the program? And I say, well, I don't know. Tell me what is the level of risk exposure that the program's being operated in? And it's a dynamic. If you're going to give a kid just mindfulness, without any other supports, and that child lives in a nice, safe, secure bubble, it will work. It will give the children all kinds of great self-regulation capacities. They won't eat the marshmallow. Those of you know what I just referred to, right? But if you did that same limited intervention, and that is all you've given a child after the Fort McMurray fires, after a major flood or disaster, the Syrian refugees coming out of the war-torn, it may work for a small percentage of the children, but it is unlikely to work for all the children. Now, the reason we know this is because I'm a scientist, right? So I look for the best scientific evidence to support my theories, and I have found it. Think about Cinderella for a minute. It's always presented as somehow it's a story of Cinderella who has succeeded and overcome the odds and done great. I mean, she was an orphan child, right? Her mother dies, during childbirth or something like that. Her father raises her. He's a really doting, loving man, whatever. And then she's left with the evil stepmother and the evil stepsister. Evil stepmother. Poor stepmothers. They always get a bad rap in these stories. And then what happens is that, she has this kind of fairy godmother. Of course, she has friends, right? She has birdies that she talks to and all kinds of other animated things. And eventually this fairy godmother comes along and think about it. The story is misnamed. This story has almost nothing to do with Cinderella. Her resilience is the story of the fairy godmother. Think about it. Who wouldn't do well if you didn't have someone who could turn pumpkins into golden carriages, right? And so the story is about the fairy godmother. And this is how her success happened. And I think sometimes we forget that we are all fairy godmothers, and fairy godfathers if you prefer, right? And that the science of resilience is actually saying that on the whole, when you look at the amount, if you want some scientific language, the amount of variance which is accounted for in the models, much more of the variance in terms of change is accounted for by the fairy godmother than by Cinderella's own internal qualities. Think about it. Cinderella at 15 or 16, I work mostly with street children. I work a lot with kids who are street involved. That's my major part of my clinical practice when I'm practicing. Think about her at the age of 15, 16. She's living under the stairs. She's being treated like a child laborer. She has these evil, taunting, bullying older siblings. Her stepmother is abandoning her. What does she do at 15 or 16 years old? She gives them all the finger. She runs out from the house, right? And she has to do something. So what is she going to do? She's not going to end up in the palace. She ends up behind the palace, on the street, finding food, swapping sex for a place to stay at night. I mean, basically her pathway is into prostitution and everything else. Now, I'm not trying to make light of this, but the story of Cinderella the princess or Cinderella the prostitute is really just the one of whether or not she gets the resources she needs to become resilient. I've probably ruined that bedtime story now for you, haven't I? So what we're understanding is that this notion of resilience really has to be encapsulated into understanding things in sort of a social, historical context. What resources are realistically available? We're seeing tectonic shifts right now politically in terms of what people are going to get. How can you be resilient if you don't have access to health care? I just went through an operation in Canada here. I mean, let's just say, you know, like, really? How can we talk about resilience without politicizing that context and that conversation to healthcare and access to healthcare? Children in our Aboriginal communities in Canada, I have colleagues who are studying pain in Indigenous children in Canada. And they tend to, because they don't have as ready access to medical interventions, they tend to be in more pain. I'm talking physical pain, toothaches, body pain, all kinds of physical ailments that my own children, coming from a much more privileged standpoint, did not experience. And that pain influences how they do at school. This is not a conversation that we have about resilience in this isolated, siloed sense that just give them a little bit of something. We have to think in these much more complex, terms. So, if I could then, maybe I think psychological resilience, if I can sort of focus a bit on that, though it's interesting, our work now is, as I say, we're actually now running large multi-million-dollar studies of resilience. We just recently got some very large funding from the Canadian government in which we're going to be looking at biological resilience, psychosocial resilience, community resilience, and even the resilience of the environment in communities affected by oil and gas production, as well as communities in our Arctic where there's a tectonic shift in terms of the climate change factors. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to model this, and it's interesting to hear Dan talk about this integration. Did you catch the synergy? What he's talking about is if a baby has an environment that somehow reflects well for them, that is integrated, mother, child. I would go school, child. I go community, child. And now the environmentalists are even saying that we have a rich environment of green spaces and non-toxic spaces that are actually congruent with what we need. What we're understanding is that actually affects our neurological integration, our chemical cortisol, our cortisol production, our stress hormone production. Where we're understanding is that this modeling now becomes this kind of confluence of factors. So again, a program, you're entering a school with a program, but that program is starting almost a domino effect of changes between the social life of children, their interactions, how they think about themselves in the world, their sense of contribution beyond. And what I'm hearing is that the program thinks like that. The program doesn't just say, okay, teach a child about what a baby thinks at age 1. Like, that's a very narrow thing. But when you're actually talking about citizenship and other kinds of larger goals, then you're starting to talk about resilience in what it is actually understood to be. And so I'm going to say that resilience in a context of exposure to adversity, because that's what resilience means, there's some adversity. It's our capacity to navigate to all those kinds of resources that we need to sustain our well-being. But it also seems to be our capacity to negotiate for those resources to be provided in ways that are culturally meaningful to us. Now, if I could boil this down to just some very, very simple terms, I'm going to say that resilience in an applied sense, not in a sort of a completely abstract sense. It's about this interaction between our environments and the systems and ourselves, and it brings out our capacities. But fundamentally, it's about, can we navigate to get what we need, and can we negotiate to get what we need in ways that make sense to us? Negotiation's always a tough one. Any of you ever offered the program in a place that it didn't quite match people's needs, or you've offered a different program and people just like didn't show up? Ever? Nobody had a failed program ever? I've had failed programs. No? You're not allowed to say this? Like, come on, you've gone into a community, said, you're going to benefit from, and it's like it falls flat. And I say that sometimes I think what happens is that sometimes if the groundwork isn't there and there's not a good match between what people are saying they need and what they actually want, then I think sometimes this disconnection occurs. We do research all around the world on resilience. We look at all kinds of populations under stress, and what we're understanding is this pattern. People navigate to what they need. What they need depends on locally constructed priorities, a negotiation for what's important, culturally relevant patterns. There's always that back and forth that we see in the work that we do. Now, I don't want to sort of leave this as completely, post-structuralist, blah, blah, blah sort of stuff, that there's no definites. We obviously see themes appear globally in what makes a particular child resilient. They repeat, but it's an emerging story. So I'm going to suggest that there are 9 things that are more likely to predict resilience. And if you want to read about this, there is a book. I've written about this more from a clinical point of view in a book called Working with Children and Youth with Complex Needs. That's more the clinical side, more for parents and sort of educators and people sort of more in the, if you want a simpler read on this, it's called I Still Love You, 9 Things that Troubled Kids Need from their parents. But essentially what we're seeing is these patterns. Kids seem to need structure and consequences in their lives. Little Ginny, who stole the candy, right, was kind of asking for some expectations on her. She had nobody noticing her. She had no sort of routines in her life. Her mother was extremely busy. She didn't kind of feel like there was any consequence to her actions. Nobody was noticing you. These are fundamental things. And I know that these are all parts of empathy and parts of things. These are lessons that the program teaches that kind of get at the foundations. But fundamentally, we see these themes repeating. People like to have structure and they like to have consequences. They also, by the way, children seem to need globally, no surprise, parent-child connections. But here's the interesting thing. Not just that. I very often have unfortunately, maybe shared the stage and people say, oh, it's all about parent-child connections. And the truth of the matter is when people are under stress, that's not the case. All over the globe, it's actually the minority opinion that it's the primary caregiver who looks after the child during a stressful period of life. Most cultures in this globe would think that that's a ridiculous assumption, that the most stressed person in the child's family life, the parent, is the one that then has to nurture the child. The child would be passed around to all the aunties and potentially the uncles. There'd be an emphasis on fathers and other resource people. And that's why really what we're understanding is the parent-child connection is one of the mechanisms that makes us resilient, but it's not the only one. Number 4, lots and lots of other strong relationships are super important to children's psychosocial development. I worked with there was a boy, he's about 10 years old, very awkward. He'd been raised in dire poverty. His teeth were awful. He had hand-me-down clothing, and it was like, he had a big target on him in the school that said, pick on me, sort of thing, or that type of thing. And though the school had done what they could to try and keep him safe, this kid hated going to school. So what he had done was he had adapted and found his own pattern of resilience by hiding with the janitor at lunch breaks and at the recess breaks. Rather than going out on the playground where he didn't feel safe, he would hang out with the janitor. And the janitor was this gruff old guy, like just salt of the earth, down to earth kind of guy, right? That would sweep the floors and mop the floors. He was really good with the kids. He was just kind of honest. On the weekends, he'd go out hunting moose or whatever. This is in the Maritimes, right? So, very sort of easily to access kind of guy. The kid loved being in his shadow. So the kid supposedly hung out by this guy for like a week or so to protect himself, right? His adaptation, his pathway, his navigation to the resources he needed. About after a week, the janitor looks at this kid and goes, and he had a bit of a sort of a Newfoundland brogue or whatever, so I can't quite do it. So anyways, but he kind of says to the kid, well, bloody hell, If you're always going to be underfoot, you might as well pick up a mop and give me a hand. Now, I don't know about occupational health and safety laws and stuff like that. I'm sure he just broke every single one, right, by having the kid help. But basically, the kid picks up the mop and begins to sort of mop the floor with the janitor on the brakes. Now, a whole bunch of things magically happen in that case. The child begins to feel a genuine connection and contribution to the welfare of this adult. He's actually being mentored by this adult, right? What's also neat is his changing relationship with his other peer group. Because let's face it, if you walk into a public building and someone is mopping, you have to be one mean little effer if you're going to walk across that wet floor, right? You tend to defer. So suddenly this kid who always was being jostled in the playground, jostled in the hallway, picked on, everything else, he's holding a mop, he's mopping the floor, the kids do this around him. He literally parts them with his mop. Now my point is that what you see there is a pattern where this kid was getting a very powerful identity, a sense of efficacy or control through that relationship, not with his parent, who is a very stressed individual with addiction problems and poverty and a lot of other stuff going on. The janitor had set some structure, some consequences. The child had a sense of belonging, number 7, in this world that had become his space finally. He had, in a sense, a purpose to go to school again. I'm going to argue he even had a bit of social justice. Finally, people were treating him, the one who was mildly, quote unquote, in his mind, disfigured, awkward looking, the one who dressed poorly. Suddenly he was being treated fairly, and what's more, he felt safe. I could go on literally for hours telling you story after story after story like that, in which this matrix of these 9 factors come together in a child's life. Now, here's the interesting thing. These can all be facilitated by us, by programs, by interventions, by good social policy. Just like, by the way, it was interesting this morning we heard a couple of people, I think David, you mentioned the adverse childhood experience studies, and I think Dan also sort of alluded to those. I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with the adverse childhood experience studies, those 10 things that if they happen to you before your 18th birthday, things like exposure to violence, sexual abuse, victimization, a parent goes to jail, divorce, a parent with mental illness and addiction, all those kinds of things, right? What's interesting about those, have you ever noticed that list, though? All 10 of those are preventable social factors. None of them are internal individual factors. Have you noticed that? They can all be addressed by social policy. In other words, if you want to address heart disease and diabetes and somatic illnesses and a variety of other things which are the outcome of a high ACE score, you can actually do that by using good social policy and good social interventions in a child's early life. Isn't that wild? The same thing here. All 9 of these things that produce resilience are not only about the individual. Now, if you do all 9 of these things, you would probably produce a child who's going to have a very much more positive attitude towards life, who's going to have, going to be able to sort of have the robustness to get through a crisis. If you added to this, by the way, mindfulness practices, if you add to this a cognitive behavioral intervention that allowed the child to sort of begin to sort of not misperceive and catastrophize their life when bad things do happen, and you add all these things, then you're getting essentially what it is that makes us resilient. It's that combination of things. When I was a little while ago, I was in the States down in Baltimore visiting something called Northwest Collegiate. It's back just a few years ago. And Northwest Collegiate had the notorious reputation of having all the kids that got kicked out of every other school in Baltimore. This was a high school. And basically they were the dumping ground. I don't know if you know that. Very interesting school. They brought in a new principal, a guy named Jason Hartley, who's no longer there, but when he was there. And he basically said, I'm gonna make this situation work. When he got there, there were almost 500 critical incidents a year in that school. 500. We're talking rapes, assaults, gun violence, drug busts, those kinds of, these are heavy things that were happening in the school. Now, he brought it down through a series of interventions to in the 100 to 200 range. Not great by any, but still amazing change. And when I went to visit him in the school, it was just an amazing experience to be walked around because this was a school, literally his claim to fame when he took over the school was that every single child had failed the state exams. That was the claim to fame. When he left, the marks were coming up. But not only that, the level of school engagement, children were coming to school again. And what kind of got me was, as I tell the story, these things begin to appear in combinations together. So he does things like, for instance, he brings in community people to be the hall monitors. They look like the kids. They talk like the kids. So when a kid wants to go to the toilet from their bathroom, from their classroom, one of these hall monitors meets them. Now think about it. They're not just escorting them like the prison guard to the toilet. They're talking to the kid in a language, culturally relevant way that the kid can connect to. He begins to open up the gyms. He makes sure that every child who wants to participate on any sport can actually access something after school, which of course, he also sends his teachers home to visit the kids in their homes, so that when they assign homework and it comes back doggy-eared and coffee turned on it and ripped up or not done, they understood that the kid was actually living in a household of 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom flat with 3 or 4 or 6 other people, and that his homework table wasn't a nice little computer screen down in the basement of their 5,000 square foot McBungalow in Yorkville or whatever, but he was actually doing this at the kitchen table in a tiny little space while mom, who may have been strung out on something, was actually working hard or whatever, right? When you get the context of all that, you begin to sort of create this basic empathy, and they began to adapt things to meet the needs of these kids. The best part of it, though, the best one was, he had a problem with violence in the school. And of course, like a lot of these inner city schools, they had, at the front door, they had police officers in flak vests, and they had the metal detectors. It was more secure than an airport, practically, to get into the school. And what Jason did was, he got rid of all that. It was a gutsy move on his part. But he put instead at that front door the ultimate security weapon, the ultimate security force he put at that door. 2 grandmothers. When the kids come through the door, they're checked into the school by these 2 grandmothers. And the idea was, I mean, come on, you got to be one mean little effer if you're going to mouth off to a grandmother, right? I don't care who you are, right? So the kids would come in, they'd check it, and there was always, and he said that what happened was, if they couldn't come into the school because they'd done something really nasty and they were expelled for the day or something like that, there was at least a conversation. Oh my gosh, you're not coming in today. You can't come in, honey, but come back tomorrow. And how's your mother doing? It was that notion of engagement. And if you think about this, we're talking about giving kids other relationships, powerful identities as potential for the future, a sense of control, a sense of belonging, being treated fairly, and all these other things which are absolutely essential. So let me put you through a little bit of a test here. Let's think about this on your own lives for a minute. How resilient are we? Here's a series of questions to ask yourself. We have more sophisticated resilience measures. Those of you who actually want to do research on this, we have very sophisticated child and youth resilience measure, a 12-item protocol and a 28-item protocol. It's available for free. We give it away. You can go on my website, resilienceresearch.org. You can find it there under the tool basket. But in a more popular conversational way, let me ask you these questions. How resilient, in a sense, are we? How would you answer these questions? Could you complete these questions? There are people in my life who expect me to blank. Can you finish that sentence? Do you have somebody who expects you to do something? Like before you left home today, your spouse. Maybe they expect you to actually do something, like empty the dishwasher or take out the garbage or something like that, right? Consequences. When I don't meet expectations, I know that blank will happen. Are you sure if you didn't take out the garbage this morning and your spouse is really pissed off at you? Do you know actually where that garbage is going to end up tonight in your bed or something like that, right? Is it somewhat predictable, right? Relationships. I can reach out to my blank to get help when I need it. Is that part of your life? Do you have that? Keep going. I feel respected for what's special about me when I'm with or at or doing. Is that part of, is it predictable? And I don't care what someone's disability, disadvantages. Usually those kinds of questions can be answered. Power and control. In my blank, I get to participate in making decisions that affect my blank. Again, do you have that? Do you have that sense that you can make those decisions somewhere in your life? Belonging or spirituality, a sense of cohesion, culture, whatever. At my blank, people, miss me when I'm not there. Do people know you're not at work today? Is anybody kind of noticing that? Sense of culture. There are places such as blank where I can celebrate my culture and my beliefs. I love the study, again, on the west coast of Canada that was done with some of the indigenous bands, some of the indigenous communities by Crystal Lawn and Mark Chandler, in which they actually looked at what distinguished of the 192 different indigenous bands, tribal groups out in BC. Some have epidemically high proportions of suicide amongst their kids. I mean, it's truly a tragedy on unparalleled scale in this country. But the interesting thing was about half of the communities had no suicide over the last 14 years. Some had astronomical levels, some had absolutely none. But fully half of the communities on the West Coast had no suicide in their community. How could that be such a spread? How can you have like 10 suicides a year and none a year? When they're matched almost culturally, they experience much of the same exclusion and everything else. How does that happen? And what they identified was a set of factors, such as, were women involved in the governance of the band? Was there a cultural space in the community that people used? Not a gymnasium that was converted, but actually a space to celebrate culture. They did other things like, was there a volunteer fire department in the community? Any of you live in communities where there's a volunteer fire department? If you do, you know why that would be significant, because you have to have a certain level of social cohesion, sense of moi, if you want to come back to Dan's term this morning. That notion of otherness, that sense of cohesion in your life to sustain that. All to say is, what they concluded, I think, being young and an Indigenous person in Canada is not a risk for suicide. Let me repeat that. Being young and Indigenous is not a risk for suicide. Being young, Indigenous, and living in a community without adequate control, where your identity is excluded, where you experience racial bias, where your land claims aren't being settled, where all these social factors are failing you, is a risk for suicide. And thus, what I'm coming around to is understanding that we fundamentally need to begin to think about the building blocks of creating this more integrated, holistic sense of ourselves. And these questions are basically, now I'll keep going here. When I'm with others at my blank, am I treated fairly? Again, thinking about your own experience. Safety, or when I'm with others, I am responsible for myself or someone else. That genuine sense of responsibility that brings with it all kinds of advantages. I'm well cared for by, and I feel safe when I'm with or at. Now, if you can answer those questions, that is going to just be so profound in your life. What I'm trying to say is, if you're thinking about, if people who raise their hand at 7, 8, 9 of those things, when we hit a speed bump, we're going to be able to withstand the stress much better because we have this collection of things around us. And again, if I add to that then the cognitive practices, then we seem to really be able to withstand stressors. But it's this combination of this environment bringing out the best in me that actually makes it possible for me to survive and thrive. What we're now beginning to also understand is, to account for resilience, we have to begin to think more about differential impact. And this comes back, I will say, to a program like Roots of Empathy. The question for me is, as a researcher, is which kids does the program have the most impact on? Like, if you really tracked it, I do believe that every child should have the program. Absolutely. But I'm going to guess that it's the children who are the most vulnerable, and they may be inside those classrooms. But I'm going to guess that it's the children who are the most vulnerable who are going to record the greatest amount of change as a consequence of the impact of the program. Now, what I'm also understanding is that the impact of those 9 things I just talked about are going to vary depending on your level of stress exposure. So when we do research, we always assess risk exposure, access to the 9 things, or if you like, your protective and promotive processes in the middle, and then we set a bunch of outcomes. So that is always the structure of our research models. We work in mixed methods design, so culturally, make sure that it's culturally relevant and stuff like that. But that tends to be the pattern, is you need always to ask, at what level of risk exposure is this particular program optimally operating for to produce a certain set of outcomes? And that's the gist of it. Let me give you a completely different example. Take you outside of Canada for a moment. Take you to northern Japan, if I could. You're of course familiar with the earthquake that then caused a tsunami, and then afterwards, of course, the nuclear disaster in northern Japan. I'm working with some colleagues over there, principally a fellow named Keiji Akiyama, and he's been trying to understand the trauma caused by those events on children in northern Japan. And I went up with him at one point. We were over there and just trying to get a sense of the research and what he was up to and trying to support him as best we could. What you may not know is that actually more children survived than adults. And the reason for that was that the schools were inland a little ways. And the schools, this happened at noon on a school day. And the children were evacuated up when the tsunami alarms went off. They evacuated the children, as was protocol. In other words, good social policy saved the children. The parents who were down in the floodplain and in the factories, of course, didn't experience quite the same fate. What was interesting was, and I want to make this a little more complicated because I'm talking about the differential impact. So how do you resolve trauma in a situation like that? How do we facilitate resilience in this particular population of kids? And what I saw the Japanese do was, one, they managed to get people resettled. This was remarkable. They managed to get their kids back to school within 3 weeks. Do you know how long people were out of school in High River, Alberta? Like months and months. Do you know how long they were out of school down in post-Katrina? Months and months. Now you think about all the things I've said make us resilient. Connections, continuity, structure, consequences, attachment, being treated fairly, and everything else. The Japanese, they had that capacity within their culture to immediately respond, get kids rehoused, try and keep them in their same school districts with their same peer groups. There was a real emphasis on continuity of attachments and engagement. All the NGOs came in and basically set up these after-school schools for these kids to attend. Now, this is really culturally specific. If you're a Japanese child, your day is basically you go to school all day, go home, get a snack, and then you go back to school all evening and on weekends. Because part of your job is to get to university. So I often hear people say, well, you know, we should instill hopefulness in children to be more robust. You don't tell a child to be hopeful. You give them an experience that makes them normal again. These children actually wanted to, they wanted to get out of their small little temporary houses with their parents as well, or whoever was surviving and they were living with. But they would come to these places, and this gave them a program, a structure, a sense of direction in life. It gave them the relational spaces that they were looking for. After about 3 of these, I get it, Keiji, I get it. But what about like the psychology programs, and what about the right to play, soccer clubs? What about the sports field? All the things that we would do in Canada for the kids, right? And he looked at me, you know you're having a cultural moment, when my colleague looks at me and goes, Mike, why would we want our children wasting time playing? He's not being mean. He's being culturally relevant. I mean, that is what his frame is. And so when I hear people, you know, we hear mass suicide, we hear vast social problems, really wicked social problems occurring in some of our communities in Canada, whether it's here in Toronto, in some of our recent immigrant or refugee communities that are really suffering exclusion and stuff, or we're talking about an Indigenous community up north. And we respond in this extremely narrow, silly way with parachuting in mental health professionals who are going to see kids for an hour. I say, there's been no negotiation. The kids have not been in a mirror game with us in which they said, no, I don't really want to see a psychologist, but if you give me a genuine experience of me maybe helping to make a contribution to my community, maybe I'll accept that as an intervention. And so thus, we really do need to see this back and forth. So of course, the question is always going to be, you know, which factors and processes matter the most to our kids in terms of their particular future. And clearly what we're saying is we have to always attend to what level of risk exposure. Now, one last thought, I want to sort of bring this fully around. I'm going to make this even more complicated for a second, because this is actually where the science of resilience is going. And it's this. There's actually, if you actually look at this, just very simply, if you look at that, imagine a normal developmental line up above, and then you have below it, let's say a child exposed to just a little bit of risk, and then that line that goes up and down, they hit a little speed bump in life. They hit something bad happens to them. Well, if you look at the difference of travel, A, we would know, of course, that an intervention is going to bump them up to normal development, right? And a child that's only coming through a little bit of stress gains from a program or intervention a little bit. But a child who's coming from a really disadvantaged space, the B, they're going to gain a lot. So my argument might be that the roots of empathy may in fact be having the biggest impact, the B, on the children who are coming from the most disadvantaged space. Now, I can even take this further. This is what's also kind of, unfortunately, a little bit interesting. You can actually do an intervention that has a positive impact on someone at a lower level of risk, the A, it turns them back to normal, but has a negative impact on another child. Anybody ever seen a child being prescribed a medication who's already got an addiction tendency? It's a crazy thing to do, isn't it? In other words, if you're a child at lower level of risk and your physician or whatever subscribes to you a medication, it's good, it helps you. But if you're already a kid who's into a pattern of addictions and exclusion and marginalization and you need the money from selling the drugs, that prescription becomes a negative intervention in your life. That's the sophistication of understanding interventions that promote resilience. They're always attuned to the level of risk exposure. And if I could, there's also this wacky pattern where sometimes something benefits children the most who are the most disadvantaged, but actually doesn't do anything for a child who's at lower levels of risk, or it actually harms the child. The one I love, and I'm going to close on this example and then I'll bring it around. Very simply, an example of adoption. Any of you, some of you have kids, you said, right? Now, wouldn't you agree, though, that if you're a child that's being abused and neglected in a very, very sort of problematic situation and you get adopted and you create stability and structure and all those other access to the things that you need to be resilient, that it's a really good thing, right? Adoption is generally seen as a protective mechanism. We agree? Great. Okay, so we all agree adoption is a really good thing for our kids. Okay, so any of you have kids, right? Some of you have kids? Any of you bonded to them at all? Like any of you, just raise your hand if you're kind of relatively attached to them. Just raise your hand. That's good. But now I just told you that adoption is a really good protective mechanism. So let's say we go home, and I go home to my, and I have a 14-year-old still at home, and, I'd say to him, it's been a really good run. But, I heard this adoption thing is really good for kids, so I'm going to adopt you out. He's going, whoa, I was kind of liking it here. It's a traumatic experience. Now, I don't mean to make light of this, but obviously what we need to understand is the sophistication of these models is exactly that. What is protective in one context can actually be harmful in another. And ultimately, what this really comes down to is this. The emerging science of resilience is still growing. We're still looking for what happens. How is it that different systems changing in different aspects of a child's life? How is that all going to affect them? We've got to get better at representing those stories so that we understand these complex patterns in ways that are more culturally and contextually grounded. And when we do, my argument is that our programs, that as we really are doing something fundamentally good because you're hitting all the building blocks. With something like Roots of Empathy, you're hitting the building blocks of resilience, for sure. But I do think there's still more story to be told. As we move this into other places, we also are going to have to think about what else are we not talking about. For instance, maybe it's not that one mother holding that baby. Maybe it's several women. If you're in certain Aboriginal or Indigenous cultures or other places I've been in the world, it might not be that mother that is holding that child. It could be the grandmother. It could be the auntie. There could be all kinds of other plurality of definitions. I'm just speculating on that. I don't know that for a fact. But my point is, it does cause us to stretch. So, those are some of the things running around in my head about the complexity of resilience as a more systemic idea that we facilitate in children. And it's this interaction with what people have to grow and to give, and of course what we are able to actually do with them as well. So why don't I simply leave it at that and open it up for some questions and some comments. So, thank you very much. Thanks.